Welcome to the BrainTap podcast, here to help you relax, reboot, and strengthen your overworked brain. Your host, Dr. Patrick Porter, has been developing cutting-edge brainwave training technology for 3 decades. He's been featured in national publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, and Inc. magazine, as well as major television networks such as NBC, CBS, and the Discovery Channel. Dr. Porter's latest development, the BrainTap Pro mobile app, can help you sleep better, lose weight, de-stress, quit smoking, or kick any other bad habit, all while increasing your energy, mindfulness, joy, peak performance, and more. Take the free BrainTap Pro Challenge. Simply register at braintap.pro. That's braintap.pro. On the BrainTap podcast, Dr. Porter brings together a team of experts to share up-to-the-minute news in neuroscience, brain training technology, along with how mindfulness and meditation can be used to improve your life in ways you never imagined possible. And now, here's your host, Dr. Patrick Porter.
Welcome back to BrainTap Radio, and I'm going to have a special guest here today that has a lot of information out there on the internet. She's very well read, it seems, and well educated and well promoted out there. I've went to quite a few of her sites. And Laurie Thomas, I want to welcome you to the show today. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what the listeners that might not know who you are, just tell them a little bit about yourself so we can bring them up to speed.
Okay, well, I taught myself to read at age 4 by studying the spelling of the rhyming words in green eggs and ham. And by age 5, I decided I wanted to be a writer when I grew up. So I went to school at the University of Pennsylvania where I studied economics. I studied a form of economic geography called regional science. And that taught me a lot about how to use statistics and how to use evidence from sources that are hard to put together. So whereas in a lot of medicine today, everybody expects there to be one definitive study that's going to answer all their questions in things like nutrition or epidemiology, you have to pull in evidence from all sorts of different things. So then after I was graduated with a master's degree, I went to work editing medical and academic textbooks. So I've spent the past 30 years editing college textbooks, medical journals, and so on. And lately I've been trying to pull that to get that information together in ways that can help people improve their lives.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, it doesn't look like it did too much to you to do all that studying with those books. I mean, most people get out of school, they don't want to see them again, but that's pretty interesting. So tell me a little bit about, you have a book out that caught our interest, this book that you have about Don't Feed the Narcissist. So tell us a little bit about what prompted that and why you got into that line of thinking and how your research came together on that.
Well, I started developing an interest in personality disorders in general when I was working for a company that was developing antidepressants and antipsychotic medications. So when I was reading the DSM-4, it was the DSM-4 at that time, I noticed that one of the personality disorders was pretty much my job description. So if you're a proofreader or a copy editor or something like that, the kind of things that you have to do as part of your job are the kind of things that drive people crazy about people with obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So I don't have obsessive compulsive personality disorder, but I get paid to behave as if I do. So I have to be crazy at work. It's my job. It's not my personality, it's my job. Well, then I started looking at the other personality disorders, and one of them is narcissistic personality disorder. And when I started reading about that, it helped to unravel a mystery that had been bothering me ever since I started editing. And that is that because I correct people's grammar for a living, and I correct all sorts of little tiny mistakes that they make and so forth. And some people can handle that and some people can't. And I noticed that the higher up somebody was on the food chain academically, the people who were heads of departments and so forth, they were thrilled with what I could do for them. It was the people on the very bottom that would throw temper tantrums. And then I realized later on that this is narcissistic rage. So that's how I became interested in narcissism. I've because I've been an editor for a living, for the past 30 years, I've been doing involuntary field work on narcissism.
That's very interesting. I know my wife, Cynthia, is an editor. She went to school at Cal Berkeley and got a degree, but she can't even eat dinner if there's something spelled wrong on the chalkboard at dinner. So I can understand the compulsiveness of that. And I jokingly tell people I fell in love with her when she sent back my love letter. This was 30 something years ago, so no email, but she sent back my love letters with corrections. So I knew I had to hire. I had to hire my editor. So she's the reason I have 9 books. So in the process of doing that, I know that most writing is editing or
Right.
rewriting really. So, but tell us a little bit. You had sent me some texts as we're going back and forth and learning about each other and having you a guest on the show here. You were talking a little bit about these relationship concepts you came in with, and also with my background, you realized that I had a degree in Christian counseling. And even though this podcast is doesn't have to be Christian to do it, but you had some pretty interesting insights into that. And I think that plays into some of these people with personality disorders, because we're all programmed pretty much by the religion that we're brought up in. But what do you want to add to that? Because that was some pretty amazing concepts that you had shared with me through our email correspondence.
Well, one thing that people need to understand about the concepts of sin and redemption is that they are relationship concepts. They are not necessarily religious concepts. Religious people can apply them in their religious life, but even secular people need to apply these in their personal life, because a lot of these concepts, sin and so forth, these concepts were older than the New Testament, in that the medieval Catholic theologians drew a lot of their thinking from Aristotle, for example. So he was an ancient Greek philosopher. And I draw heavily on Aristotle in Don't Feed the Narcissists. So these concepts of sin and redemption are important for everybody who's trying to navigate any kind of relationship with anybody else.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about these kind of things, and of course we're mostly concerned with how the brain and how it affects it. And of course we're all getting, I commonly say we're all getting better looking and more intelligent with age, just to keep a positive spin on it. But in all of your research and how this happens, what do you think is when somebody has these negative emotions, like we talked about, like shame or remorse or guilt, how does that play a role in their health?
Well, I don't know so much about their physical health. What I'm really focusing on in Don't Feed the Narcissist is their mental health. I have 2 other books about physical health, but 3 other books about physical health. What I'm concerned about with my first book, Not Trivial, and Don't Feed the Narcissist, deal with the kind of education that you need in order to be a reasonable human being. And the ancient Greeks had put together this curriculum called the liberal arts. And they were called the liberal arts because the ancient Romans thought that they were appropriate for freeborn men as opposed to slaves. The classical liberal arts curriculum is divided into 2 sections, the verbal portion and the numerical portion. So the verbal portion consists of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And grammar is the study of how words are altered and combined to form meaningful sentences. Now people think, oh, grammar's boring, I hated grammar in school. Grammar is the ability that separates human beings from chimpanzees. We can understand grammatical concepts, chimpanzees can't. That's why chimpanzees can't talk, not even in sign language. I mean, they can't even, even if you taught the chimpanzee signs for banana, Laurie, and give, or what you think mean those things, the chimpanzee will probably use them to beg for bananas. But the chimpanzee will never be able to tell you that Laurie gave me 2 bananas yesterday, or I would gladly pay you 2 bananas today. They can't do that. But human beings can. And the fact that we can underlies our morality. So our basic morality is based on these grammatical concepts, such as I and thou. I discussed that in Not Trivial. And questions like should, thou shalt not. These are grammatical concepts. So you really need to have a good solid grounding in grammar in order to be a moral person, in order to be able to follow a moral code, because otherwise you won't be able to parse what those commandments mean.
Right. So tell me a little bit about what inspired you to go into this line of research and writing. Um, I mean, you told us a little bit about green eggs and ham, but is there some other inspiration that,
Well, yes. When I was working as a copy chief for a publishing company, which meant that I had to be in charge of the quality, the editorial quality of all of our publications. And I noticed that a lot of people who had English degrees were not good writers. They were not good enough writers to be good technical writers. And I studied what was wrong about their writing, and I realized that they didn't understand some basic grammatical concepts. So I developed some handouts and turned people from bad writers into good writers almost overnight. I was amazed at how much better their writing got so quickly. So I got such a good reputation for that I was invited to write the grammar column for the American Medical Writers Association journal. So then when I decided, well, let me write a book about grammar. And then I started saying, well, why did they stop teaching grammar? And that led me into the question of why has this study been suppressed, and why has basic literacy been suppressed? Because, I mean, it used to be illegal to teach any Black people to read in much of the United States before the emancipation. And those laws were overturned with the 14th Amendment. But we still have that drive to suppress education for the working class. You can really see that if you look at what the robber barons of the Gilded Era were saying to each other out loud. That they were wanting to suppress the education for the masses. And that's now with the rise of the internet and so forth, people can't buy stuff online if they can't read. So that desire to suppress education is less now than it was.
right? So in your doing these things, and part of what we do at BrainTap and what our group, our tribe, if you will, they're all into doing things like mindfulness, affirmations, meditation. Can you tell us how any of that plays into your research or in your daily life? What happens for you in those areas?
Well, one of the things that I warn people about in Don't Feed the Narcissists is that you should not affirm things that are incorrect. If you're going to make affirmations, make sure they're affirmations of things that are correct. And
can you give me an example of one of those so maybe the listeners can understand where you're coming from there?
Well, the central problem in narcissism is that people are not good at the things they think they're good at. Narcissists think that they're better and smarter and more deserving than other people think they are. So as a result, narcissists will want to occupy this very high rank in society. They feel this sense of entitlement. And when people do not bow down to them and worship them as they worship themselves, they can get aggressive. And I explained in the book that a lot of the mass shootings are really motivated by narcissism. A lot of murders are motivated by narcissism. So when what you need to do is find things that are true and affirm the things that are true.
Okay. And how do you use that in your life? I mean, as a practical example for our listeners to, when you're putting together your research or finishing up a book, do you ever use any of those techniques?
Well, my favorite technique is when I write something about chemistry, for example. I send it to a friend of mine, who's a chemistry professor, and he will correct my mistakes, and I will grow from that. So I find people who I look up to, who are authorities on things, and I depend on them for guidance. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people miss.
Yeah. So along that same line, what would you say is one of your biggest adversaries or things that have happened to you in your life that you've overcome through your studies or research or just in your life in general that our listeners can say, wow, this person went from X to Y?
Well, I think that writing Don't Feed the Narcissist was the most therapeutic thing I've ever done in my life. And because I went through all of these concepts like social rank and competition, and because narcissists are they're very conscious of rank and they're very competitive. And I'm not a very, I'm not a competitive person at all. I'm the least competitive person, maybe the second least competitive person you'll ever meet. I don't even want to compete for the bottom on that. But the thing that nowadays when people throw a narcissistic rage tantrum at me, I just say, look, this is why I don't want to be friends with you. And it shocks them. It just shocks them. And then they leave me alone. And I mean, I managed to walk away from the encounter with my dignity intact, and then it makes it clear, it sets a boundary.
That's excellent. So what do you like most about what you do? I mean, most people, when you think about math and science and English and things like that, those are the subjects they run from, and you seem to run toward them. In fact, made it your career to help people to improve these in schools and things of that nature. So what do you like most about that?
Well, I think the reason that people run from a lot of these things is that they're badly taught. And they're, when you teach things, and when you use a bad method of teaching reading, for example, the predominant method in many schools in the United States is to have children memorize whole words as shapes instead of teaching them to sound the words out letter by letter. And when I mention this to somebody from Europe, they laugh, and then they say, "Oh my God, you're serious? They really do that in the United States? No wonder Americans can't read." And yet, when I talked to a lot of elementary school teachers in the United States, and I said this sight word method is a bad idea, but I mean, I get such narcissistic rage directed at me that it singes off my eyebrows. I have to paint them on afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if their method works, why is it that we have 1/5 of the population having, quote, dyslexia, unquote? Dyslexia is not a real disease. It just means that nobody taught you to read. What I like to do is learn things. I have this insatiable desire to learn things. And I also have this desire to figure out how to learn things and figure out how to teach things, and about important things like literacy and things like how to prevent people from dying of diabetes, for example. So these are things that, I want to take all of this stuff that I learn, and I want to present it to people in such a way that it can enhance or save their lives. So that's what drives me.
That's excellent. So what would you say is the best advice you've ever gotten from someone?
The very best piece of advice I ever got was from my father when I was in 3rd grade, and I had to write something. And he said to get the dictionary out, and we had to write about some concept or whatever. And he said, look that word up in the dictionary, see what it means. And then use that as the springboard for what you're going to say. And the idea of that words have specific meanings, and you should know the meaning of the words that you use, especially when you're writing, and that you should always write by, or would you also always start your piece of writing by looking the words up in the dictionary. I mean, that's the best advice anybody's ever given me.
Excellent. So you've written so many books, you've been pretty prolific out there. Most people aren't that way. So what do you attribute that success for, your productivity?
I'm a freelance writer. And when my lance is free, I write something for my own purposes, and I can type 120 words a minute. So, I get an idea in my head, and it's on paper before you know it.
That's great. So in all of the books, one of the things too is that in the brain tapping world, we have programs for diabetes. And I noticed you have books on that. And of course, we don't tell them specifically what to do. Our doctors do that part of it, but we help them to mentally stay on a diet or do those kind of things. But tell us a little bit about your angle on that, because your books were talking about thin and fat and
Right.
all of that. So Tell me a little bit about what the spin is on that. So those listeners that are out there that are have this disorder can maybe get some insight and go online and get your book.
Okay. The word diabetes came from the Greek word for siphon, which is a tube that's used to move water from one vessel to another. And it originally meant any disease that made you pee too much. So, and as you know, frequent urination is a symptom of diabetes. By the 18th century, they knew that there were 2 different kinds of diabetes. One of them that made you produce urine that was very sweet, and they called that diabetes mellitus, which means honey diabetes. And there was another one that produced water that was so watery, or urine that was so watery that it had no flavor. That was called diabetes insipidus, because insipid means tasteless. So it was water diabetes and sugar diabetes. Now, by the 1870s, they understood that there were 2 kinds of sugar diabetes. One of them was a severe problem, an incurable problem that was always rapidly fatal and tended to occur in children who were thin to start with. And the French called that diabète maigre, or thin diabetes, because it made you lose weight so fast. Then there was another problem that was milder, that tended to occur in adults who were at least a little bit overweight. And it went away if they lost weight. And they called this diabète gras, which means fat diabetes. So if we in English speaking countries were to use those words, thin diabetes and fat diabetes, it would be easier for people to understand which is which, especially because fat diabetes is caused by too much fat in the body and too much fat in the diet. Because what fat diabetes really is, type 2 diabetes, is a defense mechanism. It is your body's attempt to avoid storing more fat in the fat cells. And so it resists insulin for this purpose. And then if it ramps up that defense mechanism, if you're a naturally thin person, if your body really wants to be thin, does not want to hold that extra weight, you can get really high blood sugar when you're only a few pounds overweight. So if that's why people with type 2 diabetes tend to be only pleasantly plump when they first get their diagnosis. Then they gain weight when the disease is treated, which is unfortunate. But the solution to this problem, and I was invited by the former editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association to co-author an editorial on this, is that the solution to this problem is to do exactly the opposite of what most doctors are telling their patients to do. And because a lot of doctors think that type 2 diabetes is a problem with sugar overload, so they'll tell them to avoid carbohydrates. But that makes the insulin resistance worse. The extra fat in the diet then makes the insulin resistance worse. So, I mean, we've known since the 1940s that the way to save lives of people with type 2 diabetes is to have them eat potatoes instead of meat.
So what other tips could you give somebody out there? Because this is a big problem now. There's so many people, and they actually think that Alzheimer's could be type 3 diabetes now, they're saying. So any connections there that you have found?
Well, yes, because if you look at the age-corrected incidence of Alzheimer's in different countries, you see that the more fat a population eats, the higher its rate of Alzheimer's. And this fits in nicely with the theory that Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes because it's similar to type 2. It has something to do with insulin resistance. So if you want to improve if you want to make your body more sensitive to insulin, you eat starches instead of fats. And again, this is something that's been known since the 1930s. And it's shocking to me that people are being told exactly the opposite. People get very angry at me for telling them this. And I mean, they get really, really angry. But I've edited nutrition textbooks. I've edited all these things. I've actually read nutrition textbooks. Most doctors have not.
Yeah. And we find that. What other things because the population, as we know, is getting more intelligent and better looking with age, and we all have this one-way ticket, and people want to keep their memories, in this way. They don't want to get dementia. Do you have any tips in your research that you could give our listeners that could help them to keep their brain sharp and keep their attention and details in order for them?
Eat plants instead of animals, and eat as little fat as possible. It's that simple.
And what do you think the role is of physical activity in all of that?
Exercise is also good, but you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet. I mean, and I learned that back in the 80s when Jim Fixx, the guy who wrote the complete book of running, he died of a heart attack while running because he was ignoring the fact that his cholesterol was so high. His cholesterol was sky high, and he said, well, the fact that I run so many miles a week gives me permission to eat anything I want, and it didn't. It was tragic.
Right. Well, I've learned quite a lot here today, but mostly I learned I don't want to play you in Scrabble. So, but another thing, is there anything that you think that I have left out that our listeners could learn about you or about a process or a technique? And then please share with our listeners where they can find out more about you. Where we'll put your links on the podcast so they can get there and they can find out about your books. But what other information? How can they get a hold of you?
Well, number one, use phonics to teach your children to read. And if you have somebody who's having trouble with reading, teach them phonics. Then if you want to improve their reading comprehension, give them a good course in grammar, including how to diagram sentences. And then as far as the nutrition goes, again, eat plants instead of animals, eat lots of fiber and as little fat as possible, and get your vaccinations. We're coming into flu season. Do get your flu shot, because I've written a book about vaccination as well. And again, oh my goodness, do people get angry at me over that?
Yeah, our audience, most of our chiropractors are very much against that. I try to stay out of that conversation just because I don't know much about it, and I don't, but I think people should do what they feel their heart should tell them to do. But so tell us a little bit more about what is your plans for the future? Where do you see yourself going with your research, and where on the horizon are you going to be, let's say, 2 to 3 years from now, 5 years from now?
Well, I want to write a book about arthritis, because I had a cousin who had very, very bad rheumatoid arthritis, and she died of complications of it in her 40s. And throughout her career with arthritis, she had been told that diet has nothing to do with arthritis, and that is totally false, absolutely totally false. So I want to write a book about that. I also want to write a book about cancer, because I want to talk about how much of an edge the dietary alterations can give you in fighting cancer. You can't, I don't want people to imagine that they should give up curative treatment for a cancer and eat, proper diet instead. But I want to give them an idea of what kind of cancer treatments are likely to work, which ones are not so likely to work, and how much of an edge they can get in the fight against cancer by eating properly.
All right, that sounds exciting. Well, I want to thank you for being our guest on the podcast. We'll make sure you get a link to it, and we'll get the promotion out there. We're putting these things together, and as we launch them, you'll learn about them, and hopefully you'll get some interest, and we'll keep spreading your word and help people understand the connection here. It sounds like a big connection between diet and all of these things, and proper education. I mean, you're kind of demystifying the whole grammar program here. So thanks a lot, and I look forward to learning more about you myself.
Well, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate this opportunity.
This show has been produced by Market Domination, LLC. To discover how you can have your own show completely done for you and turn it into a real published book and become the authority in your marketplace, go to www.marketdominationllc.com/podcast offer.